The words struck Eleanor Wilson like a slap in broad daylight. "Eleanor, you don't need to come. This party is for important people." Eleanor froze in the middle of her son's backyard. The California sun beat down mercilessly, highlighting every detail of the moment in perfect clarity. Melissa, her daughter-in-law, stood on the elevated deck, champagne flute in hand, surrounded by laughing guests Eleanor had never met. The statement had been delivered with such casual cruelty, as though Eleanor were a delivery person who had wandered into the wrong address. But this was no wrong address. This was the house Eleanor had contributed 80% of the down payment for. The house with the oak tree in the back that she herself had helped plant when Michael and Melissa first moved in 3 years ago. Time seemed to slow as Eleanor stood there clutching the small gift bag she had brought. Inside was a homemade apple pie still warm from her oven, made from the recipe Michael had loved since childhood. She had risen at dawn to prepare it carefully, weaving the lattice crust the way her mother had taught her. Now the pie felt like a foolish offering, an embarrassing reminder of her misplaced hopes. Around her, guests milled about the expansive yard, clinking glasses and laughing. A man Eleanor vaguely recognized as one of Melissa's cousins glanced her way, then quickly averted his eyes, pretending not to see her. She was invisible here, a ghost at her own son's housewarming party. The worst part wasn't the public humiliation. It was the crystallizing moment of clarity that followed. This wasn't a mistake or a misunderstanding. This was the culmination of years of subtle rejection, a pattern she had refused to acknowledge until now. Eleanor nodded slightly, turned and walked back through the side gate to her car. There was no scene, no protest, just the quiet dignity of a woman who finally understood her place in her son's life. Sitting in her car, she was surprised by her own calmness. Her heart wasn't racing, her hands weren't shaking. Instead, a strange stillness had settled over her, as if her body had been waiting for this moment of recognition far longer than her mind had. The pain would come later, she knew. For now, there was only clarity. She drove home in silence, the afternoon sun casting long shadows across the suburban streets. The radio remained off. Eleanor needed no music to fill the void in her head. The steady hum of tires on asphalt provided all the accompaniment her thoughts required. The small home she'd moved into after selling her family house welcomed her with familiar quiet. Eleanor Wilson's rich mahogany skin contrasted with her silver curls, which she typically kept neatly pinned. She carried herself with the quiet elegance characteristic of Black women of her generation, who had overcome numerous barriers to succeed. As a former senior accountant at a local insurance firm for 35 years, she had fought twice as hard to be recognized in what was predominantly a white field during her time. Her modest home featured artwork celebrating her African American heritage, family photographs, and a carefully tended rose garden that was her pride and joy. Her late husband, Richard Wilson, also African American, had taught at the local university until his passing 5 years ago. Eleanor dropped her purse on the entryway chair and moved through the rooms without turning on the lights. The golden late afternoon sun filtered through the curtains, painting everything in a soft amber glow. She sank into the armchair in the corner of her living room, the one where she usually sat to embroider or read the morning paper. From here she could see the street through the window, watch the neighborhood children riding bikes, the young couples walking dogs, the normal rhythm of life continuing without pause. No tears came. Perhaps she had already cried them all during the slow unraveling of her relationship with her son over the past few years. The signs had been there, accumulating like dust in corners she refused to clean. Melissa saying Eleanor called too often that it wore her out. Michael replying to her texts with single emojis instead of actual words. The money she sent to fix their car met with nothing but a transfer confirmation notification. The invitations that stopped coming to family dinners. The way conversation fell silent when she entered a room. Eleanor rose and walked to the old wooden filing cabinet in her small home office. The dark brown cabinet contained the careful documentation of her life, a habit from her 35 years as an accountant at the local insurance firm. Utility bills, letters from the 80s, receipts saved from her professional days, all meticulously organized. She pulled out a folder labeled Family Michael and Melissa, marked with a pink sticky tab for easy location. The thoroughness was second nature to her, like preparing financial reports for a beloved client. Inside were the records of her generosity. Home repair bill, $2,800. Spanish lessons for her granddaughter Emma, $1,200. A sofa set for Michael's previous apartment, $1,700. A bank loan she had co-signed, $15,000. These were only the ones documented on paper. The quick transfers when Michael called about an emergency car repair, the time she had handed cash to help them through the month, the birthday gifts for Melissa, so Michael wouldn't feel awkward. Those weren't recorded anywhere except in her slowly eroding sense of self-worth. Eleanor's determination to fight for justice stemmed not only from personal betrayal, but from the resilient spirit passed down through generations of women in her family who had fought for equality and dignity throughout American history. As a Black woman who had navigated systemic challenges her entire life, she was no stranger to standing up for herself, though she never expected to need those skills against her own son. Eleanor closed the folder, feeling something click into place within her mind. She took out a blank notebook, one she had purchased for gardening notes but never used. The crisp pages welcomed her pen as she began to write, listing each expense, the date, the reason who had asked, and her own reaction to the request. Each line felt like a pin popping a balloon, the balloon of her illusion that she was the perfect mother, the devoted grandmother, the accommodating mother-in-law. She didn't know exactly what she was doing yet, but one thing had become absolutely clear: nothing would be the same again. When darkness fell, Eleanor made herself a cup of chamomile tea and sat on the front porch. The autumn breeze carried yellow leaves across her small yard, dancing freely through the air, needing no permission, no invitation to exist. She thought of Richard, her husband of 40 years gone now for 5. If he were alive, he'd be furious at how they'd treated her. But he would also smile in that knowing way of his and say, "Eleanor, it's time you lived for you." She sipped her tea, the gentle bitterness spreading across her tongue. She didn't feel as bitter as she had earlier. Instead, she felt a growing sense of clarity, as if fog were lifting from a landscape she had been trying to navigate for years. That night, Eleanor didn't turn on the television. She didn't scroll through social media to see who might have posted photos from the housewarming. She just lay in bed, eyes open to the ceiling, and asked herself a question that had been forming all evening. If I stop paying, will I still be called Mom? She didn't know the answer, but she was about to find out. Morning arrived with a soft golden light filtering through her bedroom curtains. Eleanor woke earlier than usual, feeling as though her body had weathered a storm while her mind had found unexpected calm. She brewed a pot of strong black coffee, its rich aroma filling the small house, taking her back to younger days when she would gulp a hasty sip before rushing to the office. Back then, she had been Eleanor Wilson's senior accountant, respected for her attention to detail and uncompromising accuracy. People had listened when she spoke. Her opinions had mattered. Somewhere along the way, after retirement, after Richard's death, she had allowed herself to be diminished to become merely Michael's mother, valued primarily for her financial support. She set her coffee on the kitchen table and opened her laptop. The screen illuminated with a string of bank emails she typically skimmed without much thought. Today they commanded her full attention. She clicked Saved Accounts and began downloading statements, watching as the cold, precise lines of data appeared. February of last year sent Michael $1,200 as a car deposit. May $3,000 for Melissa to invest in salon equipment. November $850 for Emma's winter tuition. The granddaughter she was rarely allowed to hold because Melissa didn't like the smell of old people's lotion. Each amount brought back a specific memory. Michael calling late at night, voice tight with worry. "Mom, my car broke down. I need a replacement now. I can't get to work without a car." She had gone straight to the bank the next morning without hesitation. The word need always spurred her into action. Melissa, sitting across from her at a cafe, eyes glossy. "Mom, if I don't get more capital, the salon will close." Eleanor had emptied her emergency fund and handed it over, believing she was saving a family's livelihood. She scrolled through more statements. The The numbers kept coming steady and cold. She grabbed her notebook and began logging each transaction methodically, the way she once prepared year-end financial reports. This month, $2,000. Next month, $1,500. Another urgent need, $4,000. As her pen moved across the page, she noticed her hand trembling slightly, not from age, but from a rising anger. For years, she had effectively turned herself into an ATM with a heart dispensing funds whenever the emotional buttons were pressed correctly. She paused, took a long breath, and then totaled everything. The number hit her with physical force. $47,600. $47,600. That's what she had given them in just 5 years, not counting cash in envelopes, gifts, or the time she had quietly paid their utility bills. She read the figure over and over as if staring at a judicial sentence handed down upon her. Eleanor stood and paced her small living room, her eyes landing on an old photograph hanging on the wall. Michael's high school graduation with Eleanor and Richard standing proudly on either side of their only child. Michael in the center, blue gown diploma in hand, smile radiant. She remembered Richard whispering in her ear that day, "See, every hardship was worth it." If he were alive now, what would he think seeing their beloved son treat her like an outsider, a bank account with a pulse? She returned to the table and looked at her notebook. The numbers sat there in straight rows like silent witnesses that couldn't be cross-examined. For the first time, she wasn't seeing them as a loving mother would, but as an accountant would clear transparent and absurd. Her phone buzzed, making her flinch. Melissa's name lit up the screen. Eleanor let it ring. A text followed immediately after. "Mom, just checking on your health. Call me when you're free." Eleanor laughed out loud, the sound foreign in her quiet house. In all these years, Melissa had never called just to check on her. There was always a reason beneath the surface, a need waiting to be expressed. Rent, credit cards, tuition, new equipment. Checking on your health was simply a thin veil draped over a bottomless financial pit. She didn't call back. Instead, she closed her laptop, folded the notebook, and placed it in the drawer beside her bed. But in her mind, that number kept echoing. $47,600, the price tag of her maternal devotion. That afternoon, Eleanor visited the grocery store. She carried a small basket and selected a few essentials: milk, eggs, bread, fresh vegetables. The total came to less than $30. She paid carefully, tucked the receipt into her wallet, and suddenly found it darkly amusing. She was the kind of person who saved receipts for eggs and milk, yet had allowed tens of thousands of dollars to slip away without requesting so much as a thank you. Back home, Eleanor sat in her armchair watching the afternoon light shift across her walls. For the first time in years, she didn't feel hurt. She felt angry. Angry at her own leniency. Angry that she had allowed maternal love to be transformed into a one-way financial contract. She opened her phone and scrolled through old messages. From Michael. "Mom, we're in a bind. Can you loan me some money?" From Melissa. "Mom, rent is late this week. Can you help?" Every message followed the same pattern. Short, direct, no pleasantries or personal inquiries. Reading them now, Eleanor felt like a customer service representative on call to solve their problems. That night, she opened her notebook again and wrote one final line at the bottom of the page. "I am no longer a mother. I am the family bank, and starting today, this bank is closed." When she closed the notebook, a new current seemed to move through her chest, lighter but colder. She knew the next step wouldn't be easy, but she also knew she had crossed the hardest threshold, facing the truth about her relationship with her son and daughter-in-law. Eleanor turned off the living room lights and headed to her bedroom. In the darkness, she heard the wind whistle past her window. She pulled the covers up and closed her eyes. No longer a mother waiting anxiously for an appreciative text message, she slept like a soldier preparing for battle. The following morning, Eleanor arrived at the bank as soon as it opened. Sunlight poured through the large glass windows onto the polished floor. She had sat in this lobby dozens of times before, but everything felt different today. No more rushing to sign transfer forms for Michael. No more anxiously checking her balance to make it work. Today, she came to end the cycle. Raymond, her longtime account manager, smiled when he saw her approach. He had known Eleanor for nearly 20 years through Richard's illness, through her retirement, through the sale of her family home to help Michael buy his new house. "Good morning, Mrs. Wilson," he said warmly. "How can I help you today?" Eleanor took a deep breath, setting her thick notebook on his desk. "Raymond, I want to cancel all automatic transfers to Michael and Melissa, and I want to set up a new account separate that no one knows about but me." Raymond looked up, studying her face. Something in his eyes brightened, surprised, but also as if he had been expecting this moment. "Are you certain for 5 straight years those transfers have been like clockwork? You've never missed one?" Eleanor gave a small smile. "That's exactly why I'm here today." Raymond typed quickly, the computer screen casting a blue glow on his face. He printed out several pages and slid them across the desk to her. "These are the statements for the past 5 years. Would you like to look them over one last time?" Eleanor opened the folder. The numbers aligned in cold, impersonal rows. Each amount she had given stared back at her like an indictment. $1,200, $3,000, $850, $4,000, an endless list of her financial sacrifices. She ran her hand over the pages, not to reread the amounts, but to feel the physical reality of them. This was the evidence, the answer to every sleepless night she had spent, wondering where she had gone wrong in raising her son. She hadn't been wrong to love him. She had been wrong to turn that love into an endless financial obligation. "Raymond," she said softly, "do you remember when I rushed in here to withdraw $5,000 for Michael? You asked if I was sure, and I laughed and said it was for family." He nodded. "I remember. I worried about you then, but you seemed determined." Eleanor closed her eyes briefly. "Today, I'm more determined, but this time it's for me." She signed the cancellation form with a steady hand. Raymond closed the file and carefully slid it into a plastic folder. "All set, Mrs. Wilson. From now on, no one can access your accounts without your explicit consent. I've also opened a new savings account for you, and only you have the password. I strongly recommend you don't share it with anyone, including family." Eleanor smiled. "Don't worry, I've learned a very expensive lesson." When she stepped outside the bank, the sun hit the pavement with fierce brightness. Eleanor felt as though she had just set down a burden so heavy that her shoulders suddenly seemed weightless. For years, every visit to this building had meant watching her balance drain away to solve someone else's problems. Today she walked out believing that her money truly belonged to her again. That afternoon, Eleanor's phone rang non-stop. First it was Michael. She let it ring. Then Melissa called. She remained silent. After that, a stream of text messages appeared on her screen. "Mom, I don't see the transfer. Did you forget?" "Mom, we need money for the credit card bill this week. Text me back." "Mom, please don't do this to us. You know we rely on you." Eleanor read each message but didn't respond. For the first time in years, she allowed her phone to fall silent. No explanations, no excuses, no promises to help. Just this one more time. That evening, she took out the bank statements again, reviewing them like a farewell ritual. She drew a red line through each entry and whispered to herself, "Enough, no more." It felt like unhooking one chain after another that had bound her for years. She remembered the time she had paid for a new air conditioner for their apartment during a brutal summer heat wave. Melissa had said, "You're so kind. Without you, we wouldn't know what to do." Those sweet words had once made Eleanor feel valued, but now she recognized them for what they truly were, a way to tighten the bonds of financial dependence. Every compliment about her generosity had been a subtle hint for more assistance, and she had foolishly mistaken manipulation for love. That night, Eleanor sat by her living room window, watching streetlights spill golden pools onto the sidewalk. She wrote one final line in her notebook: "The Bank of Eleanor Wilson is officially closed permanently." She closed the notebook and placed it on her bedside table. This time she wasn't writing just for herself, but for her future, If she ever felt weak, she would open these pages and read the cold numbers to remember how many years, how much money, and how much trust she had poured into a one-sided relationship. When the clock struck 10, Eleanor turned off every light in her house. The rooms fell into darkness, but inside her there was no emptiness anymore, only resolve. She didn't know how Michael and Melissa would react tomorrow when they realized the money would no longer flow into their accounts. But she knew one thing with absolute certainty: she was ready for whatever came next, and this time, she wouldn't back down. The next morning, Eleanor had just poured her second cup of coffee when the phone rang. Melissa's name illuminated the screen. She watched it ring, making no move to answer immediately. The sound continued, insistent as a pounding fist on her front door. Finally, she picked up. "Mom!" Melissa's voice trembled with tears. "The credit card got declined. The mortgage payment bounced. We thought you forgot the transfer." Eleanor took a slow sip of coffee, letting the warmth spread across her mouth before answering calmly. "I didn't forget, Melissa. I'm choosing not to send it anymore." A few seconds of stunned silence followed, then Melissa's voice erupted. "You can't do that. We rely on you. You know that." Eleanor ended the call without another word. Her hand rested lightly on the coffee mug. Her heartbeat remained surprisingly steady. Less than 10 minutes later, Michael called. His voice wasn't soft like Melissa's. It was blunt and harsh. "Mom, what's going on? I just checked the account. No money came in. You know we have a loan payment due this week, right?" Eleanor closed her eyes and pictured his face from 20 years ago when he would throw his arms around her neck after being bullied at school. Now his accusing tone held no warmth whatsoever. "I know," she said simply, "and I've decided to stop." "What's wrong with you? Who's gotten into your head? Don't let people feed you weird ideas." Eleanor stayed quiet for several seconds, then hung up. The phone continued buzzing afterward, but she ignored it. In the afternoon, Eleanor opened her windows to let the cool autumn air circulate through her home. She heard footsteps on her front porch. Looking out, she saw Melissa standing there, hair disheveled, eyes red and swollen. Melissa rushed forward as soon as Eleanor opened the door, clutching her arm with desperate fingers. "Mom, please don't do this. If we lose the house, Emma will have to switch schools. She's only 7. She needs stability. You're her grandmother. Don't you think about her?" For a brief moment, Eleanor's heart constricted at the mention of her granddaughter. But then she remembered that for years she hadn't been allowed to spend time alone with Emma. Melissa always had an excuse. She's sleeping, she's studying, she's worried about germs. Eleanor gently freed her arm from Melissa's grip and spoke in a low, firm voice. "I have thought about Emma more than anyone, but what you just said isn't about her. It's about the money you want me to keep providing." Melissa's face transformed, anger flashing in her eyes. The tears dried up instantly. She spun around and strode toward her car, tossing back over her shoulder, "You'll regret this." Eleanor stood in her doorway, watching the car leave her driveway. She didn't feel shaky or uncertain. Instead, she experienced a new sensation: self-possession. That night, she wrote in her notebook, "Today, for the first time in years, I wasn't swayed by tears or intimidated by anger. I stood my ground." She closed the notebook and smiled to herself in the quiet darkness of her bedroom. The next day, Michael appeared at her house. He didn't knock or ring the bell. He simply stood blocking the walkway to her front door, jaw-tight, eyes hard. "Mom, we need to talk." Eleanor opened the door, but didn't invite him in. She stood in the doorway, positioned between two worlds, the home she protected inside and outside, the son who treated her like a wallet. Michael glared at her. "We can't live without your support. I'm working hard. Melissa is too. You know how expensive everything is now." "You're 35 years old, Michael," Eleanor cut in. "At your age, your father supported our entire family and bought our first house without any help. You're still leaning on your retired mother." His frown deepened, voice stiffening with indignation. "You make it sound like we've never cared about you. You think all we care about is money." Eleanor answered softly, each word weighted with conviction. Tell me, when was the last time you called just to ask how I'm doing? Michael went silent, lips pressed tight, eyes looking away. She knew he had no answer because there wasn't one. Finally, he turned and walked away without saying goodbye. Eleanor closed the door. The familiar ache of maternal disappointment was there, but she didn't collapse under it. With every refusal, she was pulling herself further from the chains that had bound her to this unhealthy dynamic. For the next 3 days, Eleanor's phone rang almost continuously. When no one answered, they left voicemail messages. The themes repeated with variations: rent, credit card debt, bank loans. She listened to them but didn't reply. Instead, she took long walks around her neighborhood. She stopped by the local bakery and purchased a warm loaf of sourdough bread as a treat. The clerk greeted her with a friendly smile and asked which jam she preferred. Eleanor felt a sudden pang of recognition. How long had it been since she had experienced a simple, pleasant conversation that wasn't about money? She brought the bread home, ate it alone at her kitchen table, savoring each bite and thinking, perhaps this is what freedom tastes like. That night, a lengthy text arrived from Melissa. Mom, I'm sorry if I said anything that upset you, but we're really in a tough spot. If you don't help, we'll lose everything. I know you don't want your granddaughter to suffer. Eleanor read it multiple times, analyzing the language. The wording sounded gentle, but she recognized the familiar scent of manipulation. They weren't asking out of love or concern for her. They were demanding out of fear of losing their only source of supplemental income. She set the phone down without replying. In the past, a message like this would have sent her rushing to make a transfer. Now she felt only relief that she had learned to stand firm. On Sunday morning, Eleanor rose early and attended church, something she had done regularly for decades. But her mind had always been tangled with worry over her children's financial problems. Today she sat still and actually listened to the sermon about forgiveness. The pastor said something that resonated deeply. Forgiveness doesn't mean accepting abuse. Forgiveness is when you let the burden fall from your shoulders and free your soul. Eleanor sat there with tears streaming down her face, unable to stop them. Not for Michael or Melissa, but for herself, the woman who had allowed motherhood to become chains for so many years. That afternoon, Melissa called again. Her voice wasn't soft this time. It was sharp with threat. If you don't send money, we'll have to take action. Don't blame us when it happens. Eleanor pressed the end call button. Her heart didn't flutter anxiously as it once would have. She knew things would likely get uglier from here, but she also knew she was ready for whatever came next. She had thought, after Melissa's vague threats, that they might quiet down and find another solution. They didn't. Just 2 days later, when Eleanor returned from grocery shopping and pulled into her driveway, Michael's gray pickup truck was parked directly in front of her house. Melissa stood beside it, arms crossed, eyes cold as steel. Eleanor stopped her car and left the grocery bags inside. She wouldn't begin this confrontation while juggling packages. Michael stepped forward, voice tight with barely controlled anger. Mom, we need to have a serious talk. Eleanor looked at him without speaking. Melissa interjected, You're hurting this family by cutting us off. Emma will suffer. Do you want your granddaughter growing up with financial hardship? Eleanor drew a long, measured breath. Emma again, the familiar shield they used to stab at her conscience. She slipped her car keys into her pocket and replied, If you truly care about Emma, learn to support your own family. A grandmother cannot be expected to raise a child for its parents. Michael's face contorted with fury. He moved closer, voice low but boiling with resentment. You're selfish. Your whole life you preached sacrifice for family, and now you're turning your back on us. Eleanor looked him directly in the eye. No, Michael. I did sacrifice for years. You never valued it. From now on, I simply won't sacrifice anymore. Melissa exchanged a glance with Michael, then switched to a syrupy tone that sounded transparently false. Mom, maybe someone has been influencing you, or you're confused. Think again. There must be a misunderstanding. We just want you to be happy. Eleanor laughed, a rough sound that surprised even her. Happy? For years you've taken every dollar, every hour of sleep, every small joy I had. If that's love, then my happiness comes very cheap. Melissa's face drained of color. The sugary facade vanished in an instant. She hissed, "Fine, if this is your choice, you'll face the consequences." Michael tugged her toward the truck. Before getting in, he turned and gave Eleanor a look that belonged to a stranger, not a son. "You'll regret this." The truck pulled away, leaving a gray stripe of dust on the quiet suburban street. Eleanor stood motionless, fists clenched at her sides. She knew those weren't just angry words spoken in the heat of the moment. They were a warning. That afternoon, Eleanor opened her notebook again. She wrote, "Today their true faces showed. No more circling, no pretense. They've made me the enemy." When she finished writing and closed the notebook, her heart felt heavy. She had prepared herself for anger and blame, but she had never imagined her own son could look at her with such cold hostility. The final illusion had been shattered, and the pain of that recognition cut deep. The next day, Eleanor visited her church again. After the service, Pastor Williams approached her, concern evident in his kind eyes. "Eleanor, are you all right? You seemed deep in thought during the service." She hesitated momentarily, then gave him a condensed version of the situation. He nodded, sadness crossing his features. "Family, when blinded by money, can be crueler than strangers. But don't isolate yourself. Seek support and protection." Those words echoed in Eleanor's mind as she drove home. She knew the gentle phase of this confrontation had ended. Now she needed to prepare for whatever came next. That afternoon, Eleanor unexpectedly received an envelope in the mail. Her name was clearly printed on the front, but the handwriting was unfamiliar, slightly messy. She opened it with cautious fingers. Inside was a typed letter, essentially an ultimatum: "If you do not continue financial support, we will be forced to pursue legal measures to protect the family's interests." Below were the signatures of Michael and Melissa. Eleanor sank into her kitchen chair, the paper trembling in her hand. So the threats had escalated from words to documented intent. She was no longer facing just tears or angry accusations. She was facing a calculated scheme. That night, Eleanor couldn't sleep. She sat in her living room under the warm glow of a table lamp, memories unspooling like an old film reel. Michael's high school graduation, his wedding to Melissa, the day she had handed them money for their first apartment, the nights she had stayed up rearranging her budget to cover their debts. All those memories distilled into one painful conclusion to them: she wasn't a mother. She was a financial resource. And when the resource stopped flowing, they treated her like a traitor. But mixed with the pain was a strange clarity. The truth had finally surfaced, stripped of pretense. No more illusions, no more faint hope that her love would someday be returned in kind. That stark truth, harsh as it was, oddly set her free. The following day, Eleanor called James Harris, her attorney, the same one who had helped with her will when Richard was alive. She described the letter and its threatening tone. Harris was silent for a moment, then said, "Eleanor, this is serious. You need to gather every piece of evidence: bank statements, texts, letters. We have to prepare for a worst-case scenario." Eleanor nodded, her heart beating faster. She was no longer in a vague, defensive position. She had officially stepped into a battle. That evening, while organizing her financial documents, Eleanor's doorbell rang. Glancing through the window, she saw Michael and Melissa again. This time she didn't answer. She stood behind the curtain, watching silently. They knocked repeatedly, called her name, then started shouting when she didn't respond. Melissa's voice carried clearly through the window. "Mom, if you don't come out, we'll tell everyone you're having mental problems. We'll show how you're abandoning your family." Eleanor remained motionless, heart aching but resolve unbroken. After nearly 10 minutes of this display, they finally left her front lawn bearing the imprints of their angry footsteps. She sank into a chair and covered her face. The pain flooded in, but within it rose a strange pride. She hadn't opened the door. She hadn't given in. That night, she added another entry to her notebook. "When they stop pretending, I see everything clearly. Their eyes, their tone, every word is a weapon. I'd rather face honest hostility than live forever in false sweetness." Eleanor closed the notebook and exhaled deeply. This was only the beginning. The next morning, Eleanor pulled back her living room curtains and noticed a familiar figure watering flowers across the street. Martha Johnson had been her neighbor for over 10 years. They had never been particularly close, exchanging only occasional hellos at church or the grocery store. Today, however, the way Martha glanced toward Eleanor's house felt like a silent question. Eleanor forced a smile and waved. Martha immediately shut off her garden hose, crossed the street, and stopped at Eleanor's fence. Martha was about Eleanor's age, perhaps a few years older, with silver hair and an energetic demeanor despite her 68 years. "Eleanor, I heard quite a commotion at your place yesterday. Is everything all right?" Eleanor froze. She hadn't planned to share her family troubles with anyone. But something in Martha's clear, kind eyes eased her reluctance. She opened the gate and invited Martha onto her porch. They sat on the weathered wooden bench, morning light filtering through the maple leaves, casting dappled patterns across the floorboards. Slowly, Eleanor told Martha everything from being excluded from the housewarming to canceling the transfers, from Michael and Melissa showing up to yell at her to the threatening letter that had arrived in the mail. Martha listened in attentive silence, nodding occasionally. When Eleanor finished, Martha reached over and gripped her hand warm and steady. "Eleanor, you are not alone. I've been through exactly the same thing. My son tried to have me declared incapacitated to take this house. I know what it's like to be seen as a walking checkbook by your own flesh and blood." Eleanor's chest tightened. Someone understood her pain with such immediate recognition. Martha explained that 5 years ago, her son and daughter-in-law had pressured her relentlessly after her husband died. They kept borrowing money for a restaurant venture, then blamed her when it failed. The situation escalated until they hired a lawyer and prepared a guardianship petition, claiming Martha was too confused to manage her own affairs. Fortunately, Martha had found a strong attorney and neighbors willing to testify to her complete competence. She had won the case. Since then, she had learned how to establish boundaries, even with her own child. Listening to Martha's story, Eleanor felt both horrified and strangely strengthened. She wasn't facing something unique or unheard of. This was a recognized pattern of elder financial abuse. "How did you get through it?" Eleanor asked. "Didn't you feel guilty about fighting your own son?" Martha looked directly at her eyes, resolute. "Of course I did. I cried until I couldn't breathe night after night. But I realized being a mother doesn't mean supporting your children for life. They grow up, start families, and must stand on their own feet. Love doesn't mean unlimited financing." Her words resonated through Eleanor like a bell. She saw how far she had traveled down the road of sacrifice, so far that she had forgotten where the reasonable limits should be. They sat together a while longer as the morning sun climbed higher. Martha squeezed Eleanor's hand again before standing. "If you need it, I'll testify for you. I've seen Michael and Melissa show up and raise their voices at you many times. The neighborhood has noticed. Don't be afraid. You have witnesses." Tears pricked Eleanor's eyes as she returned the squeeze. "Martha, you're a lifesaver. I never imagined I'd find an ally right across the street." Martha smiled kindly. "We're mothers, Eleanor. Sometimes mothers need to remind each other that we deserve protection too." That evening, Eleanor went home and opened her files again. This time, those cold numbers weren't just evidence of her own naivety. They were ammunition, and Martha had just placed a shield in her hands. She began sorting everything methodically, dating each document, clipping related text messages, printing relevant emails. As her hands worked faster, a certainty grew within her. She was no longer alone in this fight. 2 days later, Michael appeared at her house again. Eleanor looked out the window and saw him with Melissa, and this time a man she didn't recognize, dressed in a suit and carrying a briefcase. She didn't open the door. Instead, she picked up her phone and called Martha. "They're here with someone who looks like a lawyer," she whispered. Martha's voice came back steady and clear. "I'll be right over. Stay calm, Eleanor." When Martha arrived minutes later, the trio outside seemed momentarily thrown off balance. They clearly hadn't expected Eleanor to have support. Michael tried for a steady voice. "Mom, this is our legal advisor. He just wants to talk and find a solution that works for everyone." Eleanor stood behind her locked door, observing through the small window. From beside her, Martha spoke up loudly and firmly. "I'm Eleanor's neighbor. I've witnessed enough disturbances here recently. If you continue harassing her, I'll call the police immediately." The atmosphere shifted instantly. Melissa yanked Michael's arm impatiently. "Let's go. Standing here is pointless." Eleanor exhaled shakily, her hands trembling slightly. Martha laid a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "See, sometimes just one witness is enough to stop them from crossing certain lines." That night, for the first time in weeks, Eleanor slept deeply. In her dreams, she walked through a sunlit garden surrounded by the comforting presence of older women. She recognized it as the embodiment of the community strength Martha had introduced her to. The following morning, Eleanor baked an apple pie and took it to Martha's house. Her neighbor opened the door, surprise evident on her face. "Eleanor, you didn't have to do this." Eleanor smiled genuinely. "It's not about obligation. I just wanted to thank you for helping me find peace again in my own home." They sat together eating pie and drinking tea, talking like old friends. Eleanor shared stories about the good memories she had of Michael's childhood tales, buried under years of financial strain. Saying them aloud felt like releasing them from captivity. That night, Eleanor wrote in her notebook, "Today I gained an ally. Martha, a woman who understands a pain I thought only I carried. Perhaps this journey isn't just about protecting my assets. Maybe it's about learning to stand with other women who face the same battles." After Martha had stood up for Eleanor in front of Michael and Melissa, Eleanor could finally breathe more easily. But she knew their silence was only temporary, like a calm lake hiding dangerous currents beneath. Sure enough, a few days later, she received another letter. This time it wasn't Michael's messy handwriting, but a clean printout with an official law firm letterhead. The letter claimed Eleanor showed signs of mental instability requiring supervision to prevent financial risk. It also explicitly mentioned legal rights of direct heirs and fiduciary responsibility. In plain language, they were building a case to take her to court and force her to hand over control of her finances. When she finished reading, a chill ran through her body. But instead of panicking, she folded the letter carefully and placed it on her kitchen table. Then she called James Harris. "James, I need you to look at this right away." An hour later, the attorney was sitting at her kitchen table reading the letter with a deepening frown. "They're using the classic playbook, Eleanor. I've seen this many times. They want to paint you as a paranoid elder who can't manage her affairs. We need to get ahead of this immediately." "What do you suggest?" Eleanor asked quietly. Harris met her eyes directly. "We'll arrange an independent assessment by doctors and specialists I know personally. It's a preemptive measure both to document your full capacity and to shut down their primary tactic. When we go to court, these expert opinions will be your strongest defense." Eleanor exhaled slowly. For the first time in months, she didn't feel alone against an overwhelming force. 2 days later, Eleanor met with the psychologist and internist Harris had arranged. The evaluation took place in a bright medical office with large windows allowing natural light to fill the space. Dr. Moore, a thoughtful woman in her 50s with round glasses, asked Eleanor a comprehensive series of questions ranging from dates and figures to complex problem-solving scenarios. Eleanor answered each question clearly and confidently. When asked to calculate monthly expenses, she immediately recalled the exact figure of $47,600 over 5 years because it had been carved into her memory like an inscription on stone. When they finished, Dr. Moore smiled warmly. "Mrs. Wilson, honestly, your cognitive function is sharper than many people half your age. I'll write a detailed report. No one could possibly twist the truth about your mental capacity." Hearing those words, Eleanor's eyes filled with tears, not because she had doubted herself, but because someone outside her situation finally saw the truth about her, a completely lucid woman who had simply endured exploitation for too long. As Harris drove Eleanor home from the clinic, he spoke quietly but firmly. "We've landed our first counterpunch. But prepare yourself, Eleanor. Michael and Melissa won't stop here. They'll likely escalate to harder psychological tactics to make you cave. Stay strong." Eleanor nodded, her heart heavy with the knowledge that this conflict with her only child would likely get worse before it improved. Sure enough, that evening her phone rang repeatedly. This time the messages weren't angry. They dripped with calculated emotion. Melissa wrote, "Mom, do you remember when you held Emma as a baby? She keeps asking for Grandma. She cried when she heard you're upset with us. Please don't turn your back on the family that loves you." Eleanor bit her lip, fighting back emotion. She knew Emma was too young to understand any of this situation. That message wasn't her granddaughter's voice. It was a strategy Melissa had crafted. Then a text arrived from Michael. "Mom, I just drove past your house. The lights were on, but you didn't answer the door. I know you saw me. I don't want us to become strangers. I regret so many things." Eleanor sat by her window watching streetlights illuminate the empty sidewalk. Part of her wanted to open the door and run to embrace her son, to forget everything and return to the illusion of family harmony. But then she remembered the bank statements and the cold look in Michael's eyes when he had threatened, "You'll regret this." She knew these remorseful lines were just another tactic. The next day, Eleanor told Martha about the emotional messages. Martha sat across from her in the living room, took a thoughtful sip of tea, then smiled slightly. "Eleanor, they're trying everything in the playbook. 1 minute it's threats, the next it's sweet talk. That's classic psychological warfare, designed to make you waver until you can't tell what's real and what isn't. But remember, the truth is what you've seen with your own eyes, not what they type in a text message." Eleanor nodded, feeling steadier with each passing day. Martha added, "Keep every text, email, and letter. Print them all. Each line will become evidence of their manipulation. Don't delete anything." Following Martha's advice, Eleanor printed all the messages and filed them meticulously. Each page felt like another puzzle piece, exposing the true nature of her relationship with Michael and Melissa. That afternoon, while Eleanor was organizing her growing evidence file, she received a call from an unfamiliar number. "Mrs. Wilson," a woman's voice asked, "I'm Sarah Collins from Adult Protective Services. We've received a report that you're showing signs of confusion and may need a safety assessment visit." Eleanor went cold. Clearly, Michael and Melissa had filed a report with the authorities attempting to trigger an investigation. She remained calm, remembering Harris's advice. "I'm sorry, but I won't answer any questions without my attorney present." The caller sounded surprised by this response, mumbled something about scheduling a visit later, and quickly ended the call. Eleanor immediately contacted Harris and described what had happened. "Good work, Eleanor," he said approvingly. "You did exactly the right thing. This is their reverse psychology move, trying to transform your reasonable caution into proof you're paranoid. But we now have the independent assessment plus witness support. Don't let them frighten you." Hearing those words, Eleanor felt as though she had just stepped safely around a trap set in her path. That night, she sat on her front porch as a cool evening breeze ruffled her silver hair. Martha brought over freshly baked oatmeal cookies, and they ate together, watching the neighborhood settle into evening routines. "Eleanor," Martha said thoughtfully, "I used to be terrified like you. Then I realized something important: every time they try to manipulate me, they actually provide more evidence against themselves. Let them perform their little drama. We'll document it. When we finally reach court, the truth will reveal itself." Eleanor smiled for the first time in many days, and it wasn't a forced expression. She suddenly understood that instead of being hunted, she could become the witness to her own truth. Before bed, she wrote in her journal, "They think they're cornering me, but their mind games are exactly what help me see their true nature more clearly. I'm not swayed anymore. I have evidence, allies, and faith in the truth." She closed the notebook and laid her head on the pillow. For the first time in weeks, sleep came easily. Not because the storm had passed, but because she had learned how to stand steady within it. Just 1 week after the call from Adult Protective Services, Eleanor received a thick envelope stamped by the local county court. Her stomach dropped, and her hands trembled as she tore it open. Inside was a petition for determination of civil competency filed against her. Right in the first line, her name, Eleanor Wilson, appeared in quotation marks as if she were a fictional character rather than a real person. The plaintiffs were listed as direct relatives, signed by Michael Wilson and Melissa Wilson. Eleanor read through the document feeling as though someone were squeezing her chest. The reasons they cited were shamelessly absurd. That Mrs. Wilson has recently spent money irrationally on useless items, that she isolates herself and shows signs of depression and paranoia toward family members, that there exists a risk of outsiders exploiting and manipulating her assets. Eleanor let out a dry laugh that sounded like metal scraping metal. The very people who had lived off her financial support for years now dared to cast her as a victim of exploitation by unnamed outsiders. The next morning, Eleanor took the court petition to Harris's office. He read it silently, occasionally drumming his fingers on the polished wood desk. "Eleanor, this is a serious escalation, but don't worry. I've been preparing for this possibility. We'll prove this is a fraudulent filing." He opened a cabinet and pulled out the materials they had gathered: bank statements, receipts, the text messages demanding money, and Dr. Moore's comprehensive assessment report. Stacked together, they formed an impressive defense. Harris analyzed the petition carefully. "Their weakness is fabricated evidence. I'll ask the court to verify the source of everything they've submitted. If we can expose even one false document, their entire case collapses." Eleanor nodded, feeling a new surge of confidence. This time, she wasn't just defending herself. She was prepared to counterattack. As Harris had predicted, when the court sent over the complete file for them to review, he spotted something immediately suspicious. There was a medical certificate signed by a psychiatrist named Dr. Kramer, claiming Eleanor showed signs of memory decline and needed long-term monitoring. Harris checked medical licensing records and discovered that this Dr. Kramer had retired 3 years earlier. The signature on the document was clearly forged. "They created a fake medical assessment," Eleanor whispered, staring at the document in disbelief. Harris nodded grimly. "Exactly. That's our strike point. Submitting forged documents to a court is a serious offense. Once we prove this, they won't just lose their case. They'll face potential legal consequences themselves." In the days that followed, Eleanor devoted all her time to organizing evidence. Every evening, she spread files across her dining room table, creating labeled folders by topic: bank records, text messages, forged medical documents, witness statements. Martha often came over to help. She patiently read through each message and document, reminding Eleanor to remain calm and focused. "Think of it like cleaning out an old attic," Martha advised. "The more dust you clear away, the lighter you'll feel when it's finally swept clean." One afternoon, Harris called, his voice electric with energy. "Eleanor, I just spoke directly with Dr. Kramer. He's willing to testify in court that the signature is forged. This is pivotal. Their deception is about to be exposed." Eleanor gripped the phone tightly, her heart racing. All the accumulated grief and betrayal finally had a chance to be brought into the light of justice. While they waited for the court hearing date, Michael and Melissa continued their routine, alternating between emotional appeals and veiled threats. One day, Eleanor received a message. "Mom, if you drop this whole thing, we'll let everything go and be like before." Another day, it was, "If you're stubborn about this, don't blame us when the entire family hears about your mental decline." She didn't respond to any of these messages. She simply printed each one and added it to the folder labeled Manipulation Tactics. One evening, Eleanor received yet another call from an unfamiliar number. A woman's voice identified herself as a legal assistant working with Michael and Melissa, requesting to visit Eleanor's home to further assess your current health status. Eleanor laughed, no longer intimidated by these transparent attempts. "If you want to assess anything about me, you'll need to speak with my attorney. I don't allow strangers into my home unless I invite them." She hung up without a tremor in her voice. She knew that as they approached the court date, their tactics would likely become increasingly desperate. The first preliminary hearing finally arrived. Eleanor dressed carefully in a light gray suit, her silver hair neatly styled with just a touch of makeup. Looking in the mirror, she saw a composed woman who stood with quiet dignity, no longer trembling prey. Harris accompanied her to the courthouse, and Martha came to testify if needed. When Eleanor entered the courtroom, she saw Michael and Melissa sitting across the aisle. Melissa averted her eyes completely. Michael glanced up briefly, then stared fixedly at his lap. The hearing began with the plaintiffs presenting their case. Their attorney leaned heavily on phrases like mental instability, irrational spending, and asset protection. Eleanor sat still, listening without visible reaction. When they presented the medical certificate supposedly signed by Dr. Kramer Harris, stood immediately. He asked the court to compare the document with Dr. Kramer's official records. Moments later, Dr. Kramer himself entered the courtroom, a thin, white-haired gentleman with alert eyes. Holding up the document in question, he stated clearly, "This is not my signature. I have never met Mrs. Eleanor Wilson, nor have I written this report. I retired from practice in 2020. Whoever used my name on this document committed forgery." The courtroom fell silent. Eleanor glanced at Michael, who had gone visibly pale. Melissa bowed her head, shoulders shaking slightly. In that instant, it felt as though the mask they had constructed over months had been ripped away in public view. Harris continued methodically presenting Dr. Moore's independent assessment, confirming Eleanor's complete competence, the bank statements showing the consistent flow of money to Michael and Melissa, and the threatening messages and letters they had sent. Each document landed like a hammer blow against the wall of lies they had constructed. Eleanor sat quietly, clutching her purse, tears rolling silently down her cheeks, not from sadness, but from the profound relief of having the truth finally acknowledged. When the hearing concluded, the judge announced that more time would be needed to reach a final decision, but the exposed forgery had already significantly undermined the plaintiff's case. As Eleanor left the courtroom, she heard whispers from others waiting for their cases to be called. Unbelievable! Her own son forged documents to take his mother's money. She drew a deep breath and held her head high. For the first time in months, she stepped into the sunlight unafraid. Martha squeezed her hand as they walked to the parking lot. See Eleanor masks eventually fall. They can stage all the performances they want, but the truth has its own voice. That night, back in her quiet house, Eleanor wrote in her notebook, "Today they revealed their greed and deception before the law. I no longer need to prove my love. I only need to prove the truth." She closed the notebook and looked up at the ceiling, feeling a strange calm settle over her. The fight wasn't over, but she knew she was on the right path. More importantly, she was no longer a woman blinded by manipulation. She was Eleanor Wilson, and she had finally looked the truth squarely in the eye. The formal hearing was set for a Monday morning that dawned gray and overcast. Eleanor woke very early and sat at her vanity mirror for a long time, studying her reflection. Her silver hair was neatly arranged, dark circles shadowed her eyes, but her gaze remained steady and determined. She chose to wear the navy blue blazer Richard had given her for their last anniversary, paired with a simple white blouse. She wanted to appear not as a victim, but as a woman who had lived fully and maintained her dignity through difficult circumstances. Martha insisted on driving Eleanor to the courthouse. On the way, she spoke softly but confidently. "Eleanor, today, you're not only standing up for yourself, you're standing up for many mothers who've been financially exploited by their own children. Remember that when you feel afraid." Eleanor squeezed her friend's hand, feeling a quiet faith rising within her. The courtroom was unusually full. Eleanor noticed several familiar faces from church and the neighborhood. Some nodded encouragingly when their eyes met. Across the room, Michael sat beside Melissa, both with rigid expressions. Melissa wore a somber black dress, her eyes darting nervously around the room, never meeting Eleanor's gaze. Michael sat unnaturally straight, lips pressed tightly together, fingers laced in front of him. When the judge entered the room, fell completely silent. The plaintiff's attorney launched into elaborate descriptions of Eleanor's supposed financial irrationality and cognitive decline. Eleanor listened calmly, though each false accusation felt like a blade aimed at her heart. Then Harris stood, his voice low and assured. "Your Honor, my client. Mrs. Eleanor Wilson is not unstable as claimed. We have official medical reports, witness testimony, and compelling evidence that the plaintiffs have submitted forged documents to this court." He placed a thick, numbered stack of evidence on the table before him. Harris called Dr. Moore to testify first. She took the stand with confident steps. "I personally assessed Mrs. Wilson 2 weeks ago. She demonstrates complete competence with excellent memory function and clear logical thinking. There are absolutely no signs of mental illness or cognitive decline." The atmosphere in the courtroom subtly shifted. Eleanor glanced at Michael, who frowned and whispered something urgently to Melissa. Before they could respond, Harris called the key witness, Dr. Kramer. He walked to the stand holding the forged medical report. "This is categorically not my signature. I have never evaluated Mrs. Wilson or written any report about her mental status. Using my professional name in this way constitutes forgery." The courtroom buzzed with murmurs. The judge's gavel brought immediate silence. Eleanor observed Michael, who had gone completely white. Melissa trembled visibly. The truth they had tried to bury was now standing under oath. During cross-examination, Harris methodically presented 5 years of bank statements, showing line by line the transfers from Eleanor to Michael and Melissa. He paused meaningfully at the total $4,700, not counting cash gifts or direct bill payments. "If anyone needs protection here," he said deliberately, "it is Mrs. Eleanor Wilson, a mother who has been systematically exploited by her son and daughter-in-law." A ripple of whispers spread through the courtroom. Eleanor caught someone muttering "shameful" under their breath. Those whispers felt like tiny drumbeats of validation, and her heart pounded no longer from fear, but from vindication. When the judge asked if Eleanor wished to speak, she stood slowly. Her legs trembled slightly, but her voice emerged clear and unwavering. "Your Honor, I am Eleanor Wilson. I've lived 65 years, raised a family, built a career, and cared for my husband through illness. I never imagined I would have to stand in a courtroom to prove my sanity. But today, I'm not speaking only for myself. I'm speaking for all mothers who have been financially exploited and emotionally cornered by their own children. I am not mentally unstable. I've simply been silent for too long." In that moment, Eleanor felt the compassionate eyes of strangers upon her. Harris nodded approvingly. Martha wiped away a tear. Eleanor knew she had just articulated what so many women of her generation had kept buried inside. When the hearing adjourned, the judge stated that based on the evidence presented, particularly the forged medical document, the court would consider sanctions against the plaintiffs. Meanwhile, the request for guardianship over Eleanor Wilson was denied. The gavel struck with a sharp crack that sounded to Eleanor like the bell of liberation. It was the first decisive blow of justice against Michael and Melissa's scheme. They left the courtroom in silence, their earlier confidence completely evaporated. Eleanor watched them go, feeling both heartache and profound relief. She had never thought she would see the day when her own son's deceptions were exposed in court, but she also had never felt justice so tangible, so close at hand. Outside, the autumn wind had turned cool and kind. Martha squeezed Eleanor's hand tightly. "You did it, Eleanor. You stood tall." Harris smiled, his professional demeanor softening slightly. "The battle isn't over, but today we won a crucial round." That evening, Eleanor sat in her living room, the warm lamplight creating a golden circle around her chair. She opened her notebook and wrote, "Today I heard the voice of justice. It doesn't erase the loss of my relationship with Michael, but it gives me faith that truth will eventually prevail. And I know now that I'll keep walking this path however long and difficult it may be." On the day the court issued its final ruling, Eleanor sat in the hushed courtroom, her heart pounding like an ancient drum. Across the aisle, Michael and Melissa sat close together, their faces drawn tight with tension. Eleanor could see the premature gray in her son's hair, the hollows beneath his eyes, but his gaze remained icy, nothing like the little boy who once clutched her hand when learning to walk. The judge read the decision in a steady, measured voice that filled the silent room. After reviewing all evidence presented, the court fully denies the petition for guardianship over Mrs. Eleanor Wilson. Furthermore, the court orders additional investigation into the use of forged documents submitted by the plaintiffs. The gavel cracked against wood, splitting the air with finality. Eleanor closed her eyes and exhaled deeply. Months of dread and uncertainty lifted from her shoulders. Harris gently placed his hand on her arm and whispered, "Congratulations, Eleanor. You won." But at the same moment, a sharp intake of breath from Michael made her chest tighten painfully. He hung his head briefly, then suddenly stood and walked out of the courtroom. Melissa hurried after him, calling his name softly, but Michael didn't stop or turn around. Eleanor watched her son's retreating figure, his straight back, disappearing through the heavy wooden doors. In that moment, she realized she had lost him not just in court, but perhaps forever. The victory felt hollow against the weight of that recognition. Outside the courtroom, several people approached to shake her hand and call her brave. Some were strangers who had followed the case. Others were neighbors and church members who had come to support her. Martha hugged her tightly, and Harris smiled with professional satisfaction, saying she had set an important precedent for others in similar situations. Eleanor smiled and thanked each person, but deep inside, the smile felt heavy and forced. This legal triumph had come at the cost of a permanent break with the child she had loved most in the world. That night, Eleanor's house felt unusually quiet and empty. She sat alone in her living room with only a small lamp illuminating the darkness. On the side table stood a framed family photograph from a Christmas dinner years ago. Michael sat beside her, his arm loosely draped around her shoulders, both of them smiling into the camera. Eleanor touched the cold glass covering the image, tears slipping down her cheeks before she even realized she was crying. A legal victory, however righteous, couldn't fill the empty space inside her that had once held maternal joy. Memories flooded back unbidden. The day Michael started college, when she had stood at the dormitory entrance, holding him tightly before letting go. His wedding day, when she had personally arranged every flower centerpiece for the reception tables. The day Emma was born, when Eleanor had stood outside the delivery room, hands shaking with excitement as she clutched a tiny gift for her newborn granddaughter. Those moments had been her pride, the reason she had worked so hard and saved so carefully all those years. Now they felt like smoke, insubstantial, against the harsh reality of estrangement. 3 days later, Melissa called unexpectedly. Her voice was cold and formal. "You won! Congratulations! But from now on, don't expect to see Michael. He doesn't want to look at you anymore." Eleanor kept her voice steady, despite the pain shooting through her chest. "Melissa, please tell Michael I never stopped loving my son, but I couldn't let him turn me into an endless financial resource." Melissa said nothing in response and simply hung up. Eleanor sat motionless for a long time after that call ended. The pain didn't slam into her all at once. It seeped in gradually like rain soaking into parched soil. She now understood that to Michael she was no longer a mother. She was the woman who had humiliated him in court. He couldn't see that his own actions had driven her to such a public confrontation. In the days that followed, Eleanor lived more deliberately, more slowly. Martha visited often, bringing flowers from her garden or something she had just baked. She understood Eleanor's emptiness without requiring many explanations. She simply sat with her, drank tea, and let the quiet be its own form of comfort. Harris called periodically to check on her, reminding her to rest and not dwell excessively on what had happened. His calm, professional manner provided an anchor during moments when grief threatened to overwhelm her. One morning, while Eleanor was sweeping fallen leaves from her front porch, a small figure appeared at the end of her walkway. Emma stood there clutching a teddy bear, her eyes wide as she stared at her grandmother. Before Eleanor could speak, Melissa rushed up from the sidewalk, grabbed Emma's hand, and pulled her away without allowing any words to be exchanged. Eleanor stood frozen, watching her granddaughter's small form disappear down the street. A tear slid down her weathered cheek. She knew she had lost not only Michael, but any chance to be close to Emma as well. That night, Eleanor opened her notebook and wrote, "I won a battle but lost a piece of my heart. Justice offers protection, but it cannot restore a mother's love once it's been fractured." She closed the notebook and took a deep breath. Even amidst the hurt, a small flame of liberation continued to glow. She was no longer being financially exploited. She was no longer living under constant manipulation and fear, and she recognized that this choice, however painful, had preserved the remainder of her life. The next morning, Eleanor attended church as usual. When Pastor Williams asked what she would like the congregation to pray for, she simply said, "Please keep Michael safe, even if he no longer sees me as his mother." As soon as she voiced those words, Eleanor felt something lighten within her chest. She didn't expect her son to return to her now, but she still wanted him to find his way to be safe, not lost. Leaving church. Eleanor looked up at the autumn sky. Gray clouds still hung overhead, but far off at the horizon, a narrow beam of sunlight broke through. She smiled faintly and reminded herself that she still had years to live and more opportunities to give love, not to those who would exploit her, but to those who genuinely needed compassion. The legal victory had closed one chapter in her life, but the loss in her heart remained a constant companion. That was the complex truth she would need to learn to live with as she continued forward. After the trial concluded, Eleanor stayed mostly inside her small house for several days. She needed time to breathe and allow her heart to settle after such emotional upheaval. Then one morning, Martha knocked on her door, holding the local newspaper. On page 3 was a substantial article with a bold headline, "Elderly Mother Wins Case Against Son and Daughter-in-Law, a Wake-Up Call on Family Financial Exploitation." Eleanor read every line with increasing amazement. The article didn't just summarize the trial, it placed her story within a larger context. Many seniors were being quietly drained financially by their own children and grandchildren. Somehow, Eleanor had become a notable example of someone who had successfully fought back. That week, calls began coming in. Local reporters wanted interviews. Women with similar stories asked to speak with her. At first, Eleanor felt awkward and hesitant. She wasn't accustomed to having her private life exposed so publicly. But one evening, she received a call from an elderly woman whose voice shook with emotion as she described how her son had pressured her into signing over her house. The woman was terrified to fight back for fear of being completely abandoned. Eleanor went silent, then found herself weeping openly. In that moment, she realized she could not remain quiet. Her personal pain might serve a greater purpose. Martha encouraged her first. Over tea one afternoon, she said, "Eleanor, you have a strength you don't fully recognize yet. Use your story to help others. We could start a support group right here in the community." The idea sounded far-fetched initially, but something inside Eleanor responded to the suggestion. Perhaps this was how she could transform pain into something meaningful and lasting. They started small, a few weekly meetings in the church community room. Eleanor told her story, then Martha shared hers, and gradually other women began to open up. Some sobbed while speaking. Some trembled too severely to finish their sentences. But their eyes shone with the relief of finally being heard and believed. They named their group simply, "Mothers Who Won't Be Silent." The group quickly grew diverse, though Eleanor noticed many of the women who sought help were women of color like herself. They shared not only stories of financial exploitation, but also how cultural expectations of maternal sacrifice and historical marginalization had made them particularly vulnerable to such abuse. Eleanor's perspective as a successful Black professional woman brought additional depth to their discussions about reclaiming power and dignity. Word spread, and each week more people attended. Some were older women leaning on canes. Some were middle-aged, supporting elderly parents, while being exploited by their own siblings. Even a few men came admitting their adult children had pushed them into financial hardship. Eleanor listened to each story, her heart simultaneously aching and warming. She wasn't alone. A single wound had connected dozens, perhaps hundreds of hearts in shared experience. One day after Eleanor finished speaking to the group, a woman named Margaret stood up, took her hand and said with tears in her eyes, "Eleanor, because of you, I refused to sign the property transfer papers my son pressured me to sign last week. I'm not afraid of being called selfish anymore. I realize I have the right to live for myself." The room broke into spontaneous applause, and Eleanor felt the walls of her lonely isolation crumble completely. The group didn't stop at sharing stories. Harris agreed to provide legal guidance for particularly difficult cases. He began attending meetings occasionally explaining how to document financial abuse, how to recognize manipulation tactics, and how to seek appropriate help. Eleanor remembered the day he had urged her to get an independent mental evaluation. Without his counsel, she might have lost everything to Michael and Melissa's scheme. Now his expertise could protect others from similar fates. Bit by bit, their group evolved into a genuine community. They organized small fundraisers and established a modest emergency fund to help mothers who had been financially cut off by their children. They wrote letters to local officials calling for more resources to address elder abuse within families. Eleanor, who had once curled up in fear of her own son's anger, now stood before groups of strangers and spoke clearly. "We are no longer silent victims. We have a right to speak our truth and protect ourselves." Some evenings after meetings, Eleanor sat alone on her porch, watching streetlights cast warm gold onto the sidewalk. A strange peace filled her. She had lost Michael and the chance to know Emma, but she had found a new family, one bound by shared truth and courage rather than blood. She opened her notebook and wrote, "I'm no longer just the mother who suffered in silence. I'm part of a community where we lift each other toward healing." Through this unexpected community, Eleanor had rediscovered her voice and purpose. She closed the notebook and smiled into the darkness. At 65, life still held new chapters, no longer soaked in tears, but filled with quiet faith. That summer, for the first time in decades, Eleanor lived according to her own rhythm. No more mornings waking to urgent financial requests. No more phone calls that felt like emotional whips. She woke to peaceful silence, brewed strong coffee, and often stepped onto her porch, letting the morning breeze run through her silver hair. For the first time in years, each day truly belonged to her. Eleanor used a portion of her savings to refresh her home. She painted the scuffed walls a soft blue that reminded her of the ocean. She planted more roses and wildflowers in her front garden. She purchased a comfortable porch swing and hung it beneath the maple tree, creating a perfect spot to read and listen to birdsong in the afternoons. It wasn't extravagant or ostentatious, but it was a world she had chosen for herself. She began traveling, something she had postponed for years while prioritizing Michael's needs. Her first trip was a week in New Orleans, listening to jazz music and wandering the historic brick streets. Sitting alone in a small cafe watching a street musician play saxophone, Eleanor's throat tightened with emotion. Outside the whirlwind of family demands, there was still music, the sweetness of sugar-dusted beignets and friendly smiles from strangers. When she returned home, Eleanor began painting, converting the spare room that had once been piled with bills and paperwork into a modest studio. Southern landscapes, a portrait of Martha, even a self-portrait with a serene smile lined the walls like evidence of her rediscovered self. Friends from Mothers Who Won't Be Silent visited and applauded her artwork, insisting her paintings were full of life and emotion. Their enthusiasm encouraged Eleanor to continue exploring this new form of expression. One evening, Eleanor visited Richard's grave at the local cemetery. She sat beside his headstone and spoke quietly, as if he could hear her across the divide of years. "Richard, I did it. I'm no longer the woman who bowed her head, terrified of losing her son's affection. I stood up for myself, kept what we built together, and more importantly, kept my dignity." The wind moved through the cemetery trees, and Eleanor felt as if her husband were smiling, somehow proud of her newfound strength. Occasionally, Eleanor heard news about Michael and Melissa through mutual acquaintances. They had moved to a smaller apartment. Melissa now worked full-time at a nail salon. Michael was struggling between odd jobs. Eleanor felt no vindictive pleasure in these reports, only sadness. She had once hoped her son would eventually understand her position, but she now recognized that this wasn't her responsibility. She had crossed through that loss and learned to place a period at the end of that particular sentence. One Sunday morning, after a support group meeting, Martha said thoughtfully, "Eleanor, you know what's remarkable? We're not just saving ourselves. We're planting seeds for the next generation. Their children will grow up in healthier families because mothers and grandmothers found the courage to speak their truth today. Eleanor stood motionless, deeply moved by this perspective. She had never imagined her personal story might ripple outward to affect future generations. Now, as autumn returned and Eleanor approached her 68th birthday, she reflected on the extraordinary journey of the past 3 years. She didn't have unlimited time left, but every year, month and day had taken on new meaning. She had learned how to say no. She had discovered joy in simple pleasures, a morning cup of tea, an evening concert in the park, watching flowers bloom in her garden. She understood now that genuine love never came from purchasing it with financial support. True love emerged from mutual respect and authentic care. She had paid dearly for this wisdom, but she harbored no regrets. From the ruins of one relationship, she had built a meaningful life and helped others do the same. Eleanor continued leading the support group, which had grown to over 30 regular members. Their work had even attracted attention from a national organization focused on elder rights, which offered to provide resources to help them expand their reach. On a crisp October morning, Eleanor sat at her kitchen table reviewing materials for an upcoming workshop on recognizing financial manipulation. The doorbell rang unexpectedly, interrupting her concentration. When she opened the front door, Emma stood there alone now, 10 years old, clutching a small backpack. "Grandma," she said hesitantly, "I took the bus by myself. Mom doesn't know I'm here." Eleanor's hands trembled as she invited her granddaughter inside. Emma looked around curiously, as if entering a place she had heard about but never seen. "I remember you," Emma said quietly. "From when I was little, you used to sing to me." Eleanor nodded, unable to speak through the emotion tightening her throat. "Why don't you and Dad visit anymore? Did you have a fight?" Eleanor carefully considered how to respond. "Sometimes grown-ups have complicated disagreements, Emma, but I want you to know that I never stopped loving your father or you." Emma sat at the kitchen table while Eleanor made hot chocolate. They talked about school, Emma's interest in science, and the book she was currently reading. The conversation flowed naturally, as if they had never been separated. After an hour, Emma said, "Mom and Dad don't live together anymore. They got divorced last year." Eleanor absorbed this information silently. She had suspected as much from the fragments of news she had received. "Dad seems sad a lot. He mentions you sometimes when he thinks I'm not listening." Eleanor felt a twinge in her chest, but maintained her composure. "Growing up is difficult, Emma, even for adults. Sometimes we make mistakes and don't know how to fix them." As the afternoon progressed, Eleanor realized she would need to call Melissa. Whatever had happened between them, she couldn't allow Emma to worry her mother by disappearing. When Melissa answered, her voice was frantic. "Emma is missing. Have you seen her?" "She's here with me, Melissa. She's perfectly safe," Eleanor replied calmly. "She took a bus to visit me." A long silence followed. Then Melissa said, "I'll come get her right away." "There's no rush," Eleanor responded. "We're having a nice visit. I'll bring her home before dinner." Driving Emma back to Melissa's apartment, Eleanor felt a strange mixture of joy and melancholy. Her granddaughter had sought her out, crossing the divide that adults had created. At the apartment building before Emma got out of the car, she turned and hugged Eleanor fiercely. "Can I visit again, please?" "That's something we need to discuss with your mother," Eleanor answered honestly. "But I would love to see you anytime." Melissa waited by the building entrance, arms crossed defensively. When Emma ran to her, she checked her daughter quickly for any signs of distress, then relaxed slightly. "Thank you for bringing her back," she said stiffly to Eleanor. "She's a wonderful girl, Melissa. You've raised her well." Something in Melissa's expression softened momentarily. "She asks about you. I never know what to say." "Tell her the truth, whatever you believe that to be," Eleanor suggested gently. "Children understand more than we think." As Eleanor turned to leave, Melissa called after her. "Michael is struggling. The business venture failed. He's not doing well." Eleanor nodded, absorbing this information without comment. The door for reconciliation wasn't opening yet, but perhaps a small window had appeared. Driving home, Eleanor felt lighter than she had in years. The unexpected visit from Emma had given her something she hadn't realized: she still needed hope. That evening, Martha came over with a bottle of wine to celebrate Emma's visit. "See?" she said triumphantly. "Truth has its own timeline. You stayed true to yourself, and now the universe is responding." Eleanor smiled, not quite ready to embrace such optimism fully, but willing to consider it. "I'm just glad to know my granddaughter remembers me." A month later, Eleanor received a letter in the mail. She recognized Michael's handwriting immediately and sat down before opening it, preparing herself for whatever it might contain. The letter was brief but sincere. "Mom, I don't know how to begin to apologize for what happened between us. I was wrong. I let greed and pride control me. I'm getting counseling now. I don't expect forgiveness, but I wanted you to know I regret the pain I caused. Your son, Michael." Eleanor read the letter multiple times, tears flowing freely. She didn't rush to respond. This small olive branch needed time and space to be properly evaluated. But she placed the letter in her bedside drawer rather than filing it away with the legal documents, a sign of its different significance. 2 weeks later, Eleanor was the keynote speaker at a regional conference on elder financial abuse. Standing at the podium before 200 attendees, she spoke without notes, her voice clear and confident. 3 years ago, I was a woman who believed love meant never saying no to financial demands. Today, I stand before you as someone who discovered that real love includes healthy boundaries. My journey cost me dearly, but what I gained was immeasurable: my self-respect, my voice, and a community of survivors who lift each other up daily. The audience rose in a standing ovation. Among those standing, Eleanor spotted a familiar figure at the back of the room. Michael stood against the wall, applauding with everyone else, tears visible on his face even from a distance. He didn't approach her afterward, and Eleanor didn't seek him out. They both understood that healing would require time, caution, and new foundations, but his presence spoke volumes about possibilities neither had imagined a year earlier. That December, Eleanor hosted a holiday gathering for members of their support group who had no family celebrations to attend. Her small home overflowed with people, laughter, and music. Martha orchestrated the food preparation, directing volunteers in the kitchen with cheerful efficiency. As twilight fell, Eleanor stepped onto her porch for a moment of quiet reflection. The Christmas lights she had strung along the eaves cast a gentle glow across her garden. 3 years ago, she had sat in this same spot feeling utterly abandoned. Now her house hummed with voices and warmth. She heard the front door open behind her and turned to find Martha joining her, offering a steaming cup of mulled cider. "Penny for your thoughts?" Martha asked. Eleanor smiled. "I was just thinking about how lives can transform completely in such a short time, from isolation to community, from silence to voice." Martha nodded. "And the best part is how many women you've helped find their own voice. That's a legacy worth having, Eleanor." Later that evening, after the guests had departed, and Eleanor was tidying up, her phone chimed with a text message. It was from Michael. "Merry Christmas, Mom. Emma and I would like to visit tomorrow if that's okay. Just a short visit. No pressure." Eleanor sat down, reading the message several times. Then she typed her reply. "The door is always open. Come at 2 p.m. I'll make apple pie." She set the phone down and looked around her living room at the remnants of the joyful gathering, at the Christmas tree, decorated with ornaments from throughout her life, at the paintings she had created, hanging on walls she had chosen. Whatever tomorrow brought with Michael, whether reconciliation or just a tentative first step, Eleanor knew one thing with absolute certainty: she had found her way back to herself. At 68, she had discovered that it was never too late to begin again, never too late to speak one's truth, never too late to create a life of dignity and purpose. Eleanor walked to the window and gazed at the winter stars shining brilliantly in the clear night sky. For the first time in years, the future wasn't a foggy uncertainty. It stretched before her, clear and bright as a summer sunrise, filled with possibilities she was now strong enough to embrace.